The sun was slowly setting over the vast African savanna, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The heat of the day still lingered in the air, making every breath feel thick and heavy. Among the dry grass and scattered trees, a man knelt beside a massive lioness, watching as she panted in exhaustion. Elijah, an experienced wildlife ranger, could feel the weight of tension surrounding them. He had witnessed many births in the wild, but this time, something felt off. The lioness's belly was swollen and tight, larger than usual, and her golden eyes, normally filled with power and vitality, were now clouded with pain. Each contraction made her body tremble, and the low, guttural sounds escaping her throat carried a mix of suffering and desperation. Beside them, a powerful male lion stood like a sentinel, his piercing gaze locked onto Elijah's every move. Mufasa, the pride's dominant male, was on high alert. His nostrils flared as he took in deep, measured breaths, and every muscle in his body was taut, ready to react at the slightest provocation. A few feet away, another lioness paced anxiously, her ears flicking at every sound that broke the eerie quiet of the approaching night. The savanna was growing darker, and Elijah knew time was slipping away. If this birth didn't progress soon, Nala and her cubs wouldn't survive the night. He ran a steady hand over the lioness's short, warm fur, feeling the subtle tremors rippling through her exhausted body. Something wasn't right. By now, the cubs should have started coming, but there was no sign of movement. The air around him was unnervingly still. No birds chirped, no rustling of leaves in the wind, only silence. It was as if the entire savanna was holding its breath. Elijah had spent years in the wild, and he had learned to trust his instincts. Right now, they were screaming at him. Something was about to happen. Suddenly, Nala's body tensed with a violent shudder, and a strange sound broke through the silence. She let out a low, strained growl, her claws scraping against the dry earth as if trying to hold on. Her breathing became erratic, and Elijah saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Panic. He swallowed hard, sweat trickling down his forehead as he weighed his options. He knew that intervening could be dangerous, but if he did nothing, the lioness would die right in front of him. Time seemed to slow down. The only thing he could hear was the dull pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. Then, out of nowhere, a sound cut through the heavy air. A sharp crack in the brush, a rustling in the tall grass, a low, menacing growl, and it wasn't coming from Nala. Elijah's entire body went rigid. He wasn't alone. Slowly, he lifted his gaze beyond the open field. The fading sunlight cast long, distorted shadows between the trees, but in the dim glow, he saw movement. Something big, something dangerous. Elijah's pulse quickened. If his instincts were right, neither Nala, her unborn cubs, nor even he himself would make it out of there alive. Elijah's breath hitched as he scanned the darkening savanna, his pulse hammering in his ears. His eyes darted between the distressed lioness and the shifting shadows beyond the tall grass. The sound had been unmistakable. Something was out there, watching. Every instinct in his body screamed that danger was near, but he couldn't afford to abandon Nala. Her contractions were intensifying, her massive frame shuddering with each wave of pain. Time was slipping away. If she couldn't deliver the cubs soon, they would all be in serious trouble. Mufasa let out a low, rumbling growl, his golden mane bristling as he turned toward the direction of the sound. His massive paws dug into the earth, his body coiled with tension. He had sensed it too. The pacing lioness behind him stiffened, her ears twitching. This wasn't just Elijah's paranoia. Something was out there, and it was getting closer. He had spent years in the wild and knew that when predators sensed weakness, they struck. And right now, Nala was vulnerable, exposed, and unable to defend herself. Elijah swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus. He had seen situations like this before, hyenas, perhaps, or even another rogue lion looking to take over Mufasa's pride. But as he peered deeper into the darkness, a sinking feeling twisted in his gut. Hyenas would have been louder, cackling and taunting before making a move. This was different. This was something waiting for the perfect moment. The thought sent a chill down his spine. If an attack happened now, with Nala too weak to fight, Elijah would have no choice but to risk his own life to protect her. A sudden, pained roar from Nala snapped him back into the moment. Her muscles tensed, her claws tore at the ground, and her breathing became shallow. Elijah knelt beside her, carefully running his hands along her belly. The cubs weren't moving. He felt a surge of panic. Something was obstructing the birth. If he didn't act now, Nala and her unborn cubs would die right here in the dirt. There was no time to second-guess himself. Taking a deep breath, Elijah reached into his small medical pouch, pulling out a sterile blade and gloves. Intervening in a wild animal's birth was beyond dangerous, but he had no other choice. He positioned himself carefully, whispering soothing words, hoping that she understood his presence meant help, not harm. Mufasa growled in warning, his deep amber eyes locked onto Elijah, but the ranger had no time to fear the lion's wrath. One wrong move and this could end in disaster for all of them. Just as he prepared to make the first incision, the tall grass behind him exploded with movement. A blur of motion, heavy footfalls, and then, a pair of glowing eyes locked onto him. Elijah barely had time to react before the real threat revealed itself. Something deadly had been waiting for this exact moment to strike. Elijah barely had time to process what was happening before a massive shape lunged from the tall grass. His instincts screamed at him to move, but he was caught between two deadly choices: stay and protect the helpless lioness or dodge the incoming attack. In a split second, he threw himself to the side, rolling over the dry earth as a blur of dark fur crashed into the spot where he had been kneeling. A rogue male lion. The intruder was huge, almost as big as Mufasa, but leaner and covered in old battle scars. His eyes gleamed with ruthless intent. His lips curled back in a silent snarl. This wasn't just an attack, this was a challenge. Elijah knew exactly what was happening. Rogue males often attempted to take over established prides, but to do that, they had to eliminate the cubs and the mother carrying them. Nala was too weak to fight, and Mufasa, though powerful, was now facing a direct threat to his rule. A deafening roar shattered the air as Mufasa charged. His muscles rippled beneath his golden mane as he lunged at the intruder, their massive bodies colliding with a force that sent dust flying into the air. The ground trembled beneath them. Elijah scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, as the two lions became a blur of claws, fangs, and raw power. He had seen fights like this before, but this time, it wasn't just nature running its course. If Mufasa lost, Nala and her unborn cubs were as good as dead. Nala let out a weak growl, her body trembling from the effort. She could sense the danger, but she was completely helpless. Elijah knew he had to act fast. If the rogue male won, he wouldn't just kill the cubs, he'd kill Nala too. The rules of the wild were brutal, and there was no room for mercy. But Elijah wasn't about to let that happen. Gritting his teeth, he scanned the area, looking for something, anything, that could turn the odds in their favor. His eyes landed on his flare gun. It was risky, but it might be enough to scare the rogue male away, or at least distract him long enough for Mufasa to gain the upper hand. His hands moved quickly, grabbing the weapon and aiming it skyward. He pulled the trigger. A fiery red streak shot into the sky, exploding in a burst of crackling light. The sudden explosion sent shockwaves through the savanna. The rogue lion hesitated, his ears flicking back in alarm. That single moment of distraction was all Mufasa needed. With a savage roar, he reared up and sank his massive fangs into the intruder's throat. The rogue let out a choked snarl, struggling, but Mufasa's strength was unmatched. As the light of the flare flickered above them, Elijah watched, breathless, as the battle reached its brutal conclusion. The rogue lion thrashed violently beneath Mufasa's crushing grip, his claws raking deep gashes into the dominant male's side. Blood splattered against the dry earth as the two beasts struggled for control. This was a fight to the death. Mufasa's powerful jaws tightened around the intruder's throat, muscles flexing with unrelenting force. The rogue let out a strangled roar, his body convulsing as he fought against the inevitable. But Mufasa was relentless. This was his pride, his family, and he would not surrender. Elijah watched in breathless anticipation, his heart pounding as dust and blood filled the air around them. He had seen lions battle before, but this was different. This was raw, primal, and deeply personal. Mufasa wasn't just fighting for dominance. He was fighting for the very existence of his cubs. Cubs that had not yet taken their first breath. Elijah's fingers clenched around his flare gun, his mind racing through every possible outcome. If Mufasa lost, Nala wouldn't stand a chance. Neither would Elijah. With one final, savage twist, Mufasa tore free, flinging the rogue lion onto the ground with a thunderous crash. The intruder let out a hoarse, broken growl, his body twitching from the brutal assault. He was defeated, but was he dead? Elijah didn't dare move as Mufasa towered over his fallen rival, his heaving breath the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Then, in a show of absolute dominance, Mufasa let out a deafening roar that echoed across the savanna, a clear warning to any other challengers lurking in the darkness. The rogue male remained still for a moment, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. Then, with great effort, he pushed himself up onto shaky legs. His once fierce eyes were now filled with something else, fear. He knew he had lost. Without another sound, he turned and limped into the tall grass, his form vanishing into the night. The battle was over, but the real fight had just begun. Elijah turned back to Nala, whose weak, pained whimpers pulled him back to the present. The stress of the fight had drained what little strength she had left. Her body trembled as another violent contraction rippled through her. Time had run out. Elijah had no choice. He had to intervene now or she wouldn't survive. He rushed to her side, ignoring the blood and dust coating his skin. He had helped animals before, but never like this. Never with a lioness who trusted him with her life. As he steadied himself, preparing to do the unthinkable, Mufasa turned his massive head toward him. Their eyes met, man and beast. For the first time, Elijah saw something in the lion's gaze that he never expected. Not anger, not distrust, but understanding. And in that moment, Elijah knew he wasn't just fighting for Nala. He was fighting for all of them. Elijah wiped the sweat from his forehead, his hands trembling as he reached for his medical kit. Every second counted. Nala's breathing was shallow, her body weak from exhaustion and stress. Her contractions were getting stronger, but something was wrong. The cubs weren't coming. If he didn't act now, she wouldn't make it. The thought sent a sharp wave of determination through him. He had come too far to let her die. Mufasa stood just a few feet away, his golden mane still bristling from the fight. His deep amber eyes locked onto Elijah, unblinking, watching his every move. It was a dangerous game. One wrong step, one wrong touch, and the king of the savannah could turn on him in an instant. But something in Mufasa's posture had changed. He wasn't just guarding his pride anymore, he was waiting, trusting. Elijah took a deep breath and pulled on his gloves. There was no time for fear. Gently, he pressed his hands against Nala's swollen belly, feeling for movement. Nothing. His heart clenched. The cubs should have been shifting, pushing to enter the world, but they were still. Too still. A breech birth. One of the cubs was stuck, preventing the others from being born. If Elijah didn't intervene, they would all suffocate inside her womb. His pulse pounded as he carefully adjusted his position. This was it. The moment where life or death would be decided. His hands moved with practiced precision, years of experience guiding him through what should have been impossible. He felt the small shape of a cub beneath Nala's skin, positioned the wrong way. With steady pressure, he turned it gently, carefully. Nala let out a deep, pained growl, her claws raking the dirt. Mufasa stepped forward, his muscles tensing, but Elijah didn't flinch. He kept his hands steady, whispering soothing words, hoping she could understand that he was there to help. Then it happened. A sudden movement, a shift, a tiny, fragile body sliding into the world. Elijah barely had time to react before a small, wet cub landed in the dirt. It was alive. He quickly cleared its airways, rubbing its tiny body. A moment of silence, then a soft, weak squeal. The cub took its first breath. Relief flooded Elijah's chest, but he wasn't done yet. Another contraction, another push. One by one, the others followed. 3, 4, 5 cubs, all breathing, all alive. A miracle. Elijah sat back, breathless, his hands covered in blood and sweat. He had done it. Nala, exhausted but alive, turned her head toward her newborns, gently nudging them closer with her nose. Mufasa, the mighty king, stepped forward and lowered his head, not to attack, but to touch his nose to hers. A moment of silent gratitude. Elijah felt something tighten in his throat. He had just witnessed something no human was ever meant to see. Elijah sat back on his heels, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His hands trembled, partly from exhaustion, partly from disbelief. Against all odds, the cubs were alive. Tiny, fragile bodies wriggled against Nala's warm fur, their eyes still shut, their small paws kneading instinctively for milk. It was a sight few humans had ever witnessed. The beginning of new life in the wild, raw and unfiltered, and he had been a part of it. Nala let out a deep, tired sigh, her golden eyes fluttering as she nuzzled her newborns closer. The pain and struggle of the last few hours had drained her completely, but she was alive. She had won. Elijah reached out carefully, placing a hand on her side, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of her breath. A warmth spread through him, a sense of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. But the moment of peace was fleeting. A heavy presence loomed beside him. Mufasa, the massive lion, had been watching everything, his deep amber eyes locked onto Elijah. His body, still covered in fresh wounds from the brutal fight, radiated power and dominance. For a tense moment, the ranger didn't dare move. He had done the impossible, helped save the king's pride. But would Mufasa see him as an ally, or an intruder who had interfered with nature? The great lion stepped forward, his paws pressing into the dirt with slow, deliberate movements. The world seemed to hold its breath. Elijah could feel the heat of Mufasa's body just inches away. If he attacked, there would be no time to react. Then, something incredible happened. Mufasa lowered his massive head and gently pressed his nose to Nala's. A soft, rumbling sound echoed from his chest, a deep, contented growl. His golden eyes flickered toward Elijah, and for the first time, the ranger saw something in them he never expected. Not aggression, not distrust, but recognition, understanding. Mufasa took one last look at his mate and cubs, then turned and walked toward the open plains, standing tall as the guardian of his family. The fight was over. The pride was safe. Elijah let out a shaky breath, his entire body still humming with adrenaline. As he pushed himself to his feet, the weight of what had just happened finally hit him. He had risked his life for this moment, and now, standing here, he knew it had been worth it. He had saved a mother, protected a family, and, for a brief moment, bridged the gap between man and beast. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft golds and purples, Elijah took one last look at the pride. A new generation had been born, and deep in his heart he knew this was a story he would carry with him forever. The first light of dawn stretched across the savanna, casting a golden glow over the endless grasslands. The night had been long, brutal, and on the edge of life and death. But now, as the warmth of the sun touched the earth, Elijah stood in quiet awe. He had survived. More importantly, they had survived. Nala lay curled around her newborn cubs, her large frame rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. She was exhausted but alive, her golden eyes half open as she watched over her tiny offspring. 5 fragile lives, each one a miracle. The cubs squirmed and nuzzled against her, their soft mewling sounds barely audible in the still morning air. It was a sight of pure instinct, pure love. Mufasa sat a few feet away, his massive frame still and watchful. His body bore the scars of the night's battle, fresh wounds from the rogue lion's attack, but he remained unmoving, like a statue carved from the wild itself. His gaze shifted toward Elijah, unreadable and intense. The ranger could feel the weight of it, but something had changed. There was no longer hostility, no longer doubt, only acceptance. For the first time in his years as a ranger, Elijah felt something deeper than admiration for these animals. He felt connected. He had spent his life protecting them from a distance, ensuring their survival through conservation efforts and patrols. But now, he had been part of their most vulnerable moment. He had helped bring life into the world, and in return, they had allowed him to stay. They had trusted him. He took a slow step back, signaling his departure. This was their moment now. Nala had her cubs. Mufasa had defended his family. His role in their story was over. But just as he turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Mufasa, the untouchable king of the savanna, the most feared predator in the land, did something no wild lion had ever done to him before. He bowed his head, just slightly, a fraction of movement, a silent acknowledgement, a gesture of respect. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He didn't need words to understand what it meant. He was no longer just an observer. For one brief moment, he had been part of the pride. As he walked away, the sun rising behind him, Elijah knew he would never forget this night. He had come to the wild as a protector, but now he was leaving as something more. Elijah walked slowly across the savanna, his boots pressing into the damp earth still cool from the night. The golden light of dawn stretched over the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of orange and pink. Behind him, the pride remained nestled in the tall grass, Nala curled protectively around her cubs, Mufasa standing like a silent guardian. He had done his part, and now it was time to leave. As he moved toward his vehicle, parked near a lone acacia tree in the distance, the weight of the night's events settled on his shoulders. He had saved a mother. He had helped bring life into the world. He had risked everything, standing between nature's brutal reality and the chance for something greater. But more than that, he had seen something rare, something that most would never believe. A lion had acknowledged him. Mufasa's bow, subtle yet undeniable, echoed in his mind. Respect, understanding, a connection between man and beast that few would ever know. The radio in his truck crackled as he approached, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Elijah, come in. Do you copy?" The familiar voice of his colleague, Daniel, rang through the static. He hesitated before reaching for the receiver. For a moment, it felt almost wrong to speak, to break the silent, sacred moment he had just shared with the wild. But he pressed the button. "I'm here." His voice was hoarse, exhaustion woven into every syllable. "Damn, man, where have you been? We lost contact with you last night. Thought something had happened." Daniel's voice carried concern, but also curiosity. "You're not gonna believe what we saw on the drone feed. Looked like a full-on lion fight near your sector. Did you catch any of it?" Elijah paused, his fingers tightening around the radio. He could tell them everything. About the rogue lion, about Nala's impossible birth, about the moment Mufasa had looked at him, not as an intruder but as something else. But as he glanced back toward the pride, still resting in the golden glow of morning, he made a decision. "Yeah," he said finally, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I saw it. But some things, some moments belonged only to the wild." Elijah sat in the driver's seat of his truck, his fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel. The radio in his hand crackled again, Daniel's voice still waiting for more details, but Elijah didn't respond. What could he say? How could he put into words the weight of the last 12 hours? The brutal fight, the impossible birth, the silent understanding between him and the king of the savanna. He exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting back toward the pride in the distance. Nala was still resting, her cubs pressed against her belly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. 5 new lives, each one more fragile than the next. Mufasa sat nearby, his eyes scanning the horizon, his powerful body still battered from the fight. He had won his kingdom once again. But how long before another challenger came? How long before the cycle of the wild demanded more blood, more sacrifice? Elijah had spent years protecting these animals, patrolling the reserve, stopping poachers, preventing illegal hunts. He had always known nature was ruthless, but last night had changed him. He had seen the fine line between survival and death up close. He had felt it, breathed it. And yet, there was something undeniably beautiful about it. The wild was cruel, but it was also pure, uncompromising, honest. A sudden movement caught his eye. One of the tiny cubs, the firstborn, wobbled slightly as it tried to push itself closer to its mother's warmth. Elijah felt something stir in his chest. That cub wouldn't be alive if he hadn't acted. He had left a mark on this land, however small, and the wild had left its mark on him. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke his thoughts. A cloud of dust rose in the distance as another ranger truck came into view. Daniel. He was coming to check on him, maybe expecting to find some kind of wreckage, some sign that Elijah had barely made it out alive. Elijah turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, but he didn't leave just yet. He took one last look at Mufasa, whose golden eyes flickered toward him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. No fear, no threat, just understanding. Then, just as silently as it had begun, the moment passed. Mufasa turned away, his focus shifting back to his pride. The wild had no use for long goodbyes. Elijah put the truck into gear, dust kicking up behind him as he drove off to meet Daniel. He wasn't the same man who had entered this night. He had come as a protector, but now he was leaving as something more. The dirt road stretched endlessly before Elijah as his truck rumbled across the savanna. The golden morning light filtering through the dust kicked up by his tires. He could see Daniel's vehicle approaching fast, a reminder that soon, he would have to leave the world he had just become a part of. The world of the pride. The world of life and death, survival and sacrifice. As he neared the meeting point, Elijah took one last glance in the rearview mirror. The pride was barely visible now, just golden specks against the endless grasslands. Nala, curled around her newborns, was safe. Mufasa, battle-worn but victorious, stood tall beside her. It was their world, and he had been lucky enough to witness it. Daniel's truck skidded to a stop beside his, and before Elijah could step out, his friend was already there, eyes wide with curiosity. "Jesus, Elijah, you look like hell." Daniel's voice was half joking, but the concern in his eyes was real. "What happened out here? We saw movement near your sector. Thought maybe you ran into poachers." Elijah hesitated. How could he explain? How could he put into words the chaos and beauty of the night? The fight, the birth, the silent understanding between him and the king of the savanna? It wasn't something that could be written in a report or shared over coffee back at camp. It was something you had to feel, something you had to live. He simply shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Nothing like that," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Just a long night." Daniel frowned, clearly unsatisfied, but didn't push. Some things were better left unsaid. As they turned their trucks back toward the reserve base, Elijah let the silence settle. The hum of the engine, the distant cry of a bird overhead, the steady beat of his own heart. It all felt different now. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He knew he would come back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but he would return. And when he did, he would find Mufasa still ruling his kingdom, Nala watching over her growing cubs, and the endless cycle of the wild continuing as it always had. He was just a visitor here, but for one night, he had been a part of something greater. As the reserve's outpost came into view, Elijah took a deep breath and allowed himself one last thought. The wild never forgets those who respect it, and neither would he.